in talking about the making of Waterkloof, we obviously need to talk about the maestro behind it, my boss, Mr. Paul Boutinot himself. So Paul, I'm just going to ask you a few questions, but can you first of all just give us your background in the wine industry, a little bit of history, how you started and all of that?
Well, one of our ranges of wines is called Circumstance, and in fact life is often full of circumstance, so it's really just haphazard the reason why I ended up in the wine business. After school, with some very dodgy A-levels, I didn't know what to do, and effectively I ended up in London with £20 in my pocket, and eventually I got a job packing bottles of wine for a small wine merchant, and then hand labeling, but then got a job with a proper wine company, and that's really where I learnt my trade, with a French wine importer in London. Was there for about 2.5 years, so I learnt various aspects of the industry. I was taken over by the owner, shown how to taste young wines from barrel and understand winemaking, which in those days was very traditional winemaking, as well as working in the office, doing various things, shipping, order processing, doing all the different things. So eventually I worked in my parents' restaurant for a while. I decided that restaurants were not my business, although I've sort of fallen back into it, but at a 10,000 kilometre distance, which suits me. And started my wine business, which was importing French wines. So I had a Citroen Safari and imported some French wines, did my own deliveries, my own invoicing, and given that I'd had an education in how to sort of run a wine business, I did everything myself for a while, then started to employ people one by one and grew that business. Then in 2003, I think, decided that we'd make a range of our own wines in France, because I wanted to make a range of table wines, but table wines that were quite serious, as opposed to, in those days, they tended to be sugar laden for the market. So I went over, worked with some wine producers, sourced grapes, and made white wines with natural fermentation, red wines as well. So went back to making wines in a very old traditional way. So that's how I built my business up. Then it grew, luckily. I was in an industry which was in a growth phase, a fantastic growth phase. So I was very lucky in timing. Not like the last 15 years, which has been the opposite. It's been survival. Grew the business, and grew it into, with very good colleagues, grew it into a very successful distribution business, selling all over the world, but also producing wines, primarily in France, but to a lesser extent in Spain, and then from 2003 in South Africa.
And how long did it take you to find the site, Waterkloof, and why did you decide to actually build a winery in South Africa?
Well, because of the site, really. So I was always looking for a vineyard site that could produce grapes that were naturally in balance. I didn't see the point in having my own vineyard, because basically we bought grapes, and as you know, it's cheaper to buy grapes than to grow them. That's just a fact. That's where money's made, by buying grapes or by buying wine, not by growing grapes. So if you're going to grow grapes, you have to be able to make something that you wouldn't be able to make by purchasing grapes. And for that, you need a vineyard that is a very rare commodity. You need a vineyard that creates perfectly balanced grapes, where the grapes are generally low yielding, the acid levels are right, and therefore there's very little or no addition required in the winery. There's no alteration to the grape or the juice in order to transform it into wine.
Okay, and then
which Nadia makes your job a lot easier, I hasten to say.
I'm just a lucky girl, eh?
Yeah.
Hands-off approach, yeah. And when you first saw Waterkloof, which varietals popped into your head first that you wanted to plant there, that you thought would work on?
Yeah, I mean, no vineyard site in the world can take any varietal. I mean, that's why in the the Rhine or Mosel, you've got Riesling. In Burgundy, you've got Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, because you need cold winters. So every area requires specific grape varieties. And with Waterkloof, we are up to 300 meters above sea level, overlooking the Atlantic, and therefore we get a very even temperature. We don't get heat spikes. We don't get very high levels of temperature, but we don't get low levels of temperature either. So certain grape varieties are precluded, notably Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Riesling, because they all require very cold winters. And if you plant those grapes, if we were to plant those type of grapes, in the end the vines would be weakened because they'd be struggling against climatic conditions that didn't suit them. So you're then left with, well, actually quite a wide range of grapes that you can plant. In the main, I decided to plant Sauvignon higher up, as far as white grapes are concerned, and Chenin Blanc on the lower slopes. I mean, they're not particularly low, but on the lower slopes. And the two main red grape varieties, for different reasons. The first one is Cabernet Franc, because Cabernet Franc needs a very even temperature throughout spring and summer. It doesn't tolerate cold weather, and it doesn't tolerate hot weather. And Mourvèdre, because our site faces the ocean, and we therefore get the ocean breezes, which allows Mourvèdre to ripen at lower temperatures. So therefore you get very elegant Mourvèdre. So those were the two primaries. We do have some slopes, as you know, that are sort of, even though we're in an amphitheatre facing the sea, some of the slopes face north, and although they get the ocean breezes, so they are relatively cool, they nonetheless face north, and therefore we've got some Grenache planted, some Cabernet Sauvignon planted, because that's appropriate.
And in terms of the design for the winery, you obviously gave a brief to the architect. What was your vision with the design of the winery?
The starting point was the internal mechanics, not the external design. So the internal mechanics, and for that with Mitch sort of has an engineering brain. So unlike a lot of architects who don't have a clue about, mechanical engineering and stuff like that, he had an engineering brain. And the way I wanted to make wine required, he's not actually an architect, but required a designer who had that type of ability, and he had some experience in designing wineries as well. So once we designed the winery, which was basically a traditional winery, which is largely gravity fed, as little manipulation as possible. Once we design the winery, then the carapace has to be put around the winery. We're on top of a ridge, effectively, and to put Cape Dutch on top of a ridge would be completely incongruous. Cape Dutch is never on top of ridges. It's always in the more fertile, low-lying areas, and that's where it sits, and it sits very nicely in those sort of areas. If you're on top of a ridge, the idea of putting traditional Cape Dutch would just be ludicrous. So then what do you do? Everybody has a different view, but luckily Mitch and I had the same view, that we wanted a design that was elegant but industrial, and proportions. It's all about design is all about proportions. So some people love it, some people don't like it, but I think it sits quite well where it is. And I don't think at any point when Mitch was doing the design and we were looking at it, we disagreed.
No.
So it's a very functional design, but I think it sits well where it is.
So the idea was first to design the winery as the most important part, and then everything was just sort of built or constructed around that.
Yeah. So the cantilever box for the restaurant and so on, yeah.
And you knew that you wanted to preserve the fruit, and the best way to do that is to work with gravity, to not have to pump the wine around too much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's not rocket science.
And then I have to ask, your biggest headache throughout the project, if you can just quickly think of something, what would that have been?
I think throughout the whole project, the biggest headache has been the municipality. So the local council, they have been my single biggest. But we're getting there after what are we, after 2009, after 11, 12 years, we're getting near to the end of resolving those headaches.
I think a lot of people have been wanting to ask you what was your vision behind it and get to know a little bit more. So we have some photos which we'll put up of the construction and everything. So
I'll tell you, in the end, I wanted us to make wine that I like drinking. It's actually as simple as that.
Yeah. That is the best way to make wine, and you're just very lucky if other people also like what you like.
Well, some, yeah. Okay.
Often it's
All right.
the case. Yeah.
No. All right. Thanks, Nadia. Okay.
Okay, so now that you know the philosophy behind Waterkloof, and you know why it looks like it looks, we're finally tasting some wine. So the first wine we're tasting is called our Circumstance Merlot 2016. I'm standing here at the top of the winery. So the Waterkloof winery is 3 levels. And we're going to be talking about this block. So Merlot is a lovely varietal, but it can sometimes be a little bit green. So the block that we're using is actually just below our Sauvignon Blanc. So it would probably be about estimated 230 meters above sea level. It's a combination of sandstone soils, but also quite a bit of decomposed granite soils, so getting that nice heat from the earth. So with farming, traditionally, organically and biodynamically, and for all the wind that we get here, you can never overcrop at Waterkloof. So we're getting on our Merlot probably about, if we're lucky, 3 to 4 tons of grapes per hectare, so very low quantities. For the 2016 vintage, we decided to take a chance and go a little bit differently. So processing wise, we picked everything by hand into our picking crates, cooled it down, following day we process. So we sorted through the whole bunches. The whole bunches then fall into a little tank. This tank we hoist up on this beam here, goes over our wooden fermenters, and we open the door and the grapes just fall in. So in other words, we fermented it whole bunch. So with the stems, these lids come off and we get into the tank and we stomp the grapes by feet to make sure that we've got a smaller surface area impacting on the grapes. So not breaking the stems too early. We leave our wine on the skins, dependent on taste, but probably for about anything between 30 and 40 days. Like I said, we don't add anything to it. It's literally just grapes. And then from there on, we will press it in a basket press, put it to barrel, and leave it there, once again, dependent on taste. For the 2016, we left it for about 18 months, took it out, put it into a wooden fermenter, and from there on left it for another 10 months or so. We don't use a lot of new oak on it. It's good fruit, so why overpower it with new oak? We just filter it, we put it to bottle. So enjoy 2016 Circumstance Merlot. We're now standing at the bottom of the winery, so 2 levels down, and we're talking about the Circumstance Syrah 2017. The block that we use for the Syrah is, it actually gets whacked by the wind. It's a southeast facing slope. The strongest wind that we get through here at Waterkloof is the southeaster. And then we also get the northwesterly wind. So yield-wise, on the Syrah, we're probably talking about 2 tons a hectare, very low quantities. It's on sandstone soils. So processing-wise, we process it same as the Merlot, also whole bunch fermentation, also foot stomped, left on the skins, maybe for a little bit shorter than the Merlot, but it's dependent on taste. So we run down the wine after the time on the skins via gravity. So we're not pumping the wine at all. The grape skins, we put our basket press underneath the wooden fermenter here, and then we just shuffle the grape skins through, also falling through via gravity. And then we press the grape skins in our basket press, very soft way of pressing. And then we put the wine to barrel. We use older 600 litre barrels, and we leave it in there. This would have been for about 18 months. We then take it out, give it a basic filtration, and put it to bottle. So the Syrah is definitely cool climate Syrah. So you get that beautiful sort of red berries coming through. There's a lovely spice coming through, black pepper, a bit of thyme. Fresh acidity, which screams cool climate. Tannins that cover your palate structure. I usually enjoy having this with something, I would say veal works quite nicely with it, just to complement it, but I generally enjoy my red wines with food. So enjoy Circumstance Syrah 2017. Cheers.